everyone, welcome to the Hidden History of Business podcast by Me Squared Solutions. We are a crisis management and business development firm based out of Spokane, Washington. We specialize in helping people with business crises, solving problems, and we're also experts in quality management, which we tell people is the science of how smart people build up and burn down perfectly good businesses. I am Meredith Hutchison Hartley. I'm one of the founders of Me Squared, and I specialize in quality management. I'm the youngest person to ever receive a certification from the American Society for Quality. I was 18. I attended the Defense Language Institute, where I learned Thai and majored in Asian studies. I also like my music loud, my chocolate dark, and my pad thai with extra fish sauce.
I'm Frank Hutchison. I have a PhD in physics, also a retired naval officer. I have spent most of my career being an executive level janitor, which means that I'm the one that people call in when they have a mess to clean up, whatever that might be. It has been everything from a large naval base to personal crisis. Details are not available. We have...
you totally like monster movies. He obsessively likes monster movies.
Particularly Godzilla.
There are Godzillas in our office, folks.
Yes. And besides monster movies, I also like history. Claim that I can relate anything to the Battle of Midway. Mm-hmm. And I also like helping people.
My name is Emily Geddes. I'm the third partner in Me Squared Solutions. I have a bachelor's degree in theater with a double emphasis in stage management and acting, and more recently an MBA from Eastern Washington University. I read voraciously, especially nonfiction. I have my library card number memorized. Jumped out of a perfectly good airplane at 10,000 feet during my wild and woolly days. Oh, and I interned at a continuous electron beam accelerator facility in Virginia during high school.
And we're all really big geeks. That's the important thing to get out of this. We're history geeks, we're science geeks, we're business geeks, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
We like learning and sharing what we've learned with others.
And just for context, Emily and I are sisters, and Frank is our father.
So we have lots of good stories to tell on each other.
Blackmail! For some context, we started about a year ago. We wanted to do a history of business plans, because one of the things we specialize in are business plans for startups. But we got really frustrated as we were digging through the history, because just about everything we found stopped at about 1900. We found a few things going back into the Industrial Revolution, but we spent months researching the history of business, and all we found more and more was that business kind of magically popped up out of the ground sometime in the 17 or 1800s. And yeah, there were some older businesses in that, but they weren't really sophisticated, so we're not going to talk about them that much. And we kept looking and looking, and we couldn't find anything. But just because we couldn't find anything that was tagged as business doesn't mean it wasn't there.
What it really came down to is I asked the question, did the East India Company have a business plan? Mm-hmm. And no, they didn't.
Yeah, that didn't pan out so well.
They became the Walmart of their day. And how did they do that without a business plan?
Which led us to discussing Frank's experience in the Navy back when you worked for DARPA.
I had an opportunity in the submarine technology program where we had to develop new technologies for submarines. And I had all these people come to me because we had all this money we had to basically give out to develop technology with their ideas for new technologies for submarines. Well, many years before, I had acquired a line drawing. This is the side view, if you think. Cut
like
open.
A blueprint almost.
Yeah, it's not a blueprint, but it shows the outline of a submarine and all the inner parts to it.
Which submarine was it?
And it was for the SS2, the USS Plunger, which was built back in 1902 by the Holland Electric Boat Company. It was the second submarine in the U.S. Navy, and it was kind of fun to have because it's a historical thing, kind of neat thing to have up on the wall. Well, every time one of these people would come in, they would say, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and oh, by the way, I brought along this retired admiral or general. I've got the greatest things in sliced bread for submarines. And they give me their spiel, and then when they were all done, I said, well, let's compare this with my O2 submarine. And their eyes would light up, and they say, oh, the 2002 submarine? Because we were talking about building a special submarine just to put in all these new technologies. I said, no, my 1902 submarine. And I'd take them over to that line drawing, and I'd show them where their idea was already incorporated into that submarine from 90 years before.
And these are the experts. Supposedly these were experts in technology and submarines who had no clue what the history was.
And they just weren't aware of where they'd come from.
Well, and the thing was that everyone looks back at the O2 submarine as being very primitive. And in a lot of ways it was. It wasn't very big. It couldn't go very far. It couldn't go very deep. It couldn't go very fast. But Holland, who built that submarine, was a genius. He solved a lot of problems that made the submarine practical. And the way he solved it was using the technology of his day. He had limitations, yes. But I always point out to people that basically the only 3 technologies that have been incorporated into submarines since Holland's day was electronics, because he didn't have electronics in those days, nuclear power, and better materials.
Which, when you look at all of the things involved in a submarine, that's minuscule in comparison. It's very visual. I mean, it's kind of obvious thing people look at. But there are so many other things that people just take for granted in something that complex.
Very much.
And that's a kind of a trend we found as we started digging through history, is that there are a lot of things we take for granted as fact. Like, Frank, you gave me the example of shipbuilding in World War II versus the Venetian Arsenal.
In World War II, it was well known that Kaiser coffins, which were built by the Kaiser company, basically they could build a ship in 4.5 days, from the time of laying the keel to the time it got launched, which is not the time to go steaming down the river, but be launched.
Which was considered revolutionary and super efficient, and
it was applying the assembly line to ship production. Whereas before they were building cars, sending thousands of cars a day out the door, they were now doing it to ships.
But a lot of the literature makes this assumption that Henry Ford invented the assembly line, and then it was applied to ships in this way. But that's not the case.
No, the Venetian Arsenal back in 1400s had an assembly line for building ships, and they were actually launching a ship every single day.
That's insane.
But, I mean, it took them longer to build it, but they were building a ship and launching it every single day.
That's how efficient and productive they were.
Yes, and they did it in a fairly small area of the Venetian capital of Venice to support their trade and their empire.
Which is one of the things that really kind of struck us, because I've been studying history, and I never connected that as being an assembly line, as being an example of mass production done really, really well. And that's one of the things we started discussing, is that this business history is hidden because we don't call it business. But there are, just as Frank was saying with the O2 submarine, that everyone was coming up with these new ideas that weren't really new. The problem had already been solved in the past. Part of what we talk about in quality is that there are no new problems. Each industry isn't a unique special snowflake. All of our problems have been solved by someone else before, and usually by someone who has less technology than we have, less resources available. We just don't recognize it because it didn't look exactly like ours. But when you break everything down to its real components, what the problems people were solving, they've happened before, they've been solved before. In business history, people tend to look at what's happened in the last 150 years, but there are so many more problems we could be solving if we looked further into the past. We just make assumptions about it. For example, I went looking for oldest companies, and what I found was a lot of information on logos, when the earliest registered logos and trademarks were in company names. And most of those, there are a few that go back to the 1500s where people have been using the same symbols, but that's what I found, a lot of very Western-centric, very Eurocentric stuff, and it was all based off of registering corporations or marks with governments. But when you actually ask what is a logo is this mark that distinguishes a brand or a person or a product that's been made. There is no difference between the modern logos we're registering and a sword maker's mark in
feudal Japan.
Exactly, in feudal Japan, or the stonemaker's marks that were used on buildings in ancient Gaul, or any of these marks, even down to the point of guildsmen making their mark in books and registering that way. Branding is just another kind of logo, and that's been going on for centuries.
Or the sandal maker to the pharaoh.
And this is where I went all the way back even further and found an example of the earliest possible logo that, and that's still something we're investigating, but was the sandal maker for King Den in ancient Egypt. Actually had a very specific mark that was put onto all of the pharaoh's sandals and marked as having been made by him and belonging to a specific person. And then looking into all the other things that went with that, and this idea that we aren't calling them logos, but they were logos. And there are so many cool things we can learn from them if we just dig into these and we remove our assumptions and our language. And Emily, you have some really good examples of that.
As I mentioned before, I love reading, and nonfiction is kind of my little niche, and that's not really a niche, it's huge. But I love reading nonfiction, I love reading about history, and I love learning new perspectives on history. A lot of times we think that, history already happened, so we already know how it happened, we know how it's connected, we know everything we need to know about history, it's all done. But our understanding of it is constantly changing. And that's what I like to read about. There's always new understanding, new perspectives, new connections that can be made. There was this one book that I read a while ago called History in the Making by Kyle Ward, who's a professor of history. And he went through 200 years of history textbooks in school and looked at 50 different topics, 50 different events, and how they were presented differently at different times in history. And it was absolutely fascinating to look at how these single events that had already happened, that couldn't be changed because they were in the past, how the understanding of these events changed and evolved as they went on. One in particular, there's a chapter on the causes of the stock market crash in the 1930s, 1929. In a textbook in 1933, they blamed the return to the gold standard. And then in 1944, it was all Herbert Hoover's fault. And then by the 70s, the picture's starting to get a little more complex, and they're identifying the whole idea of buying stocks on margin and the housing bubble as factors. And then finally, a textbook in 1999 talks about the rampant speculation that led first to the stock market crash and then the failure of the banks. But they also end that section by acknowledging the causes of the Great Depression are still up for debate. So there's this huge shift in 60, 70 years from it was all the gold standard's fault to now there are a whole lot of factors, the housing bubble, speculation. So the event itself didn't change, but our understanding of the event changed. And I love making those connections and deepening that understanding because what we think we know is often not the whole story. We have a lot of, as Meredith was saying, a lot of assumptions about the past. There's another great book called 1491. There we go, by Charles C. Mann, that talks about what the Americas were like before Columbus arrived in 1492. And a lot of that book is debunking all of the myths that we are just sure are true about the Native Americans before Europeans got here and started settling. And it's just fascinating. Everything that we think we know isn't necessarily true.
It reminds me, I was told many years ago, no one deals with reality. They only deal with their perception of reality.
Well, and that book that I read, The History in the Making, again, there's very little commentary from the author. It's almost entirely excerpts from these textbooks. So it's fascinating taking that approach, just letting you learn from the texts themselves. Because you learn, first of all, to be a little skeptical. You can't accept everything that you read online or newspapers today as 100% accurate.
You can't?
No! Amazingly enough. Because perspectives can change so drastically that it's practically guaranteed that any analysis you read this morning is going to be strikingly different in as little as 5 or 10 years. But it also shows that everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a bias. Even those who are trying very, very hard to be objective and balanced with very honest intentions, any single explanation is going to be incomplete. There's a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. I probably butchered her name, but it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And she talks about how when we only have a single story about a people, a place, a person, an event, an idea, then we don't have the whole picture. And that's where we start having the misconceptions and the assumptions that are inaccurate, because it may be a very true piece of the puzzle, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the whole story.
And that's what we're going to be talking about throughout all the episodes of this podcast, is we're focusing on giving multiple perspectives to what the history of business was. Not just, here's stuff that was further in the past, but here are things you might not know about. We've got some amazing stories coming out of Asia and Africa and South America that most people have never heard of or never applied in these scenarios. We really want to focus on this idea that there are no new problems, and our problems were solved long ago. And that means that if you're a business owner, if you are a manager, if you're just trying to get things done, your problems were probably solved before, and all of us can benefit from learning about those. We'll spend less time, just like the admirals and specialists coming in and looking at your O2 submarine, reinventing the wheel. We don't need to do that. We can actually solve our problems faster when we have a better idea of history. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, and we're really excited to take you guys along with us on this journey.
And we'll see you in episode 2.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business, and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.